The pocket watch never ticked. Jennie Townsend had carried it for 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days without once pressing the small brass latch on its side to let the case spring open, and the silence of it against her palm had become as familiar as breathing, as necessary as sleep, as painful as the absence that had made it hers to carry in the first place. It was the autumn of 1878 when she arrived in the town of Redrock, Texas, seated atop a wagon that listed slightly to the left because the rear axle had taken a bad rut somewhere outside of San Angelo and had never quite recovered from the insult. She had driven that wagon herself for the better part of 4 days, through country that was dry and red and beautiful in a way that made your chest ache if you let it. The kind of land that looked like God had been thinking hard about something when he made it, and had not quite finished his thought. The sky above her was enormous and blue and indifferent, and the dust came up around the wagon wheels in soft orange clouds that settled on her dark skirt and the tops of her hands and the brim of her hat. Jennie was 28 years old. With dark brown hair she kept pinned beneath that hat during the day and loose around her shoulders at night, and eyes the color of good creek water where the light hits it right, something between gray and green depending on the weather and her mood. She was not a fragile woman. She had the kind of face that had been shaped by real living, a sharpness along the jaw, a steadiness in the eyes, the particular quality of beauty that comes not from youth or ease but from having endured something difficult and come through to the other side of it still standing. People who met her for the first time often found themselves wanting to know what she was thinking, and those who knew her longer knew that she would tell you exactly what she was thinking if she judged you worth the words, and that was a thing she did not do carelessly. She had been married at 23 to a man named Jennie Townsend, a good man who raised cattle and mended fences and laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them, who had loved her with the straightforward devotion of a person who did not complicate things unnecessarily. He had died 26 months ago from a fever that came on fast and did not slow down, the kind of sickness that took a strong man and hollowed him out over 9 days until there was nothing left to argue with. She had buried him on a Tuesday in the spring, under a cottonwood tree on the piece of land they had been working together in Concho County, and 2 weeks after the burial she had sold the cattle and the land, and packed everything she could fit into the wagon and pointed the horses toward somewhere else, because staying in that place with that cottonwood tree visible from the kitchen window every morning was not something she was going to be able to do. The watch had been Daniel's. His father had given it to him, and his father's father had carried it before that, and it was a good piece of work, silver-cased with a delicate engraving of a running horse on the back panel, the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of a time and a place where people had cared about making things well. She had found it on the bedside table the morning after he died, right where he always left it when he slept, because he said the ticking kept him from sleeping deep and he needed to be able to reach it in the night without fumbling. She had picked it up and put it in her apron pocket and had not put it down since. She had never opened it. Redrock was not a large town. It had the things that frontier towns generally had in 1878, a main street with a general store, a livery stable run by a man named Old Pete who smelled of horse and tobacco, and was friendly to everyone regardless of whether they deserved it, a saloon called the Dry Gulch that was neither dry nor a gulch, but had excellent whiskey, a small white church that held services on Sunday mornings and doubles as a schoolroom on weekday afternoons, a telegraph office, a barber, a doctor whose office was above the hardware store, and a sheriff whose name was Howell who wore a mustache that was too large for his face, and who took his job seriously to a degree that some people found reassuring and others found irritating. There was also a boarding house, run by a woman named Clara Delaney who was somewhere in her 60s, and had the energy of someone half that age and the opinions of someone twice it. Clara Delaney's boarding house was where Jennie Townsend went first, because she had been told in San Angelo that Clara Delaney ran a clean house with good food and did not ask more questions than necessary, and Jennie had learned to value those qualities in a landlord. Clara Delaney did ask one question that first afternoon, standing in the doorway of the front parlor with her hands folded in front of her apron. She looked at Jennie with the particular assessment of a woman who had seen many people come through her door and had gotten very good at reading them. "You staying a while or just passing through?" she asked. "Staying a while," Jennie said. "I am looking for work." Clara nodded slowly as if this was an acceptable answer. "What kind of work can you do?" "Most kinds," Jennie said. "I can cook, I can sew, I can keep accounts, I can drive a team, I can help at a ranch if there is one that needs an extra hand." Clara had looked at her a moment longer than felt strictly comfortable, and then said, "I believe I know someone who might have use for a person like you. Come inside and have some supper first, and we will talk about it after." That was how Jennie Townsend came to hear about the Hawkins Ranch for the first time, over a bowl of Clara Delaney's beef stew that was better than anything Jennie had eaten in the 4 days on the road, sitting at a long wooden table in the boarding house kitchen, with the evening light coming through the window at a low angle, and turning everything amber and warm. "Frank Hawkins runs a cattle operation about 6 miles east of town," Clara said, settling into her chair with the comfort of someone who had sat in that particular chair 10,000 times. "Been working that land going on 8 years now. He has got a good spread, nearly 1,000 acres, fair-sized herd. He brought in a cook and a housekeeper from San Antonio about 2 years back, but she went home to her family in March, and he has not replaced her properly since then. He has 2 ranch hands and they manage the cattle well enough, but the house is in a state that you would not believe, and the accounts need tending, and from what I understand his cook is himself now, which is not a situation that is good for anyone involved." "Is he married?" Jennie asked, not because the question meant anything in particular to her at that moment, but because it was practical to know these things before taking a position. "No," Clara said. "He was engaged once, a few years back, to a girl from Abilene. It did not come to anything. He is not a man who has had an easy time of things, Frank Hawkins. He is good people, though. I have known him since he came to this territory, and I will vouch for him without reservation." Jennie had nodded and eaten the rest of her stew and thought about it, and the next morning she borrowed one of Clara's horses and rode the 6 miles east to see for herself. The Hawkins Ranch was not what she had expected, though she would have been hard-pressed to say exactly what she had expected. The house itself was a solid 2-story structure of wood and stone, built with the kind of deliberate care that suggested the man who built it had been thinking long-term, had believed this was somewhere he meant to stay. The barn was larger than the house, and in notably better repair, which she supposed was not unusual for a working cattle ranch, where the animals took priority over the comfort of the humans. There was a garden to the south side of the house that had at some point been productive and ambitious, but had since been surrendered to drought and neglect, and the porch held 2 rocking chairs and a crate that was being used as a side table, and a collection of rope that had not been coiled properly. She tied her horse at the post and walked up to the door and knocked. The man who opened it was not what she had expected either. Frank Hawkins was 32 years old, tall enough that he had to put one hand on the doorframe when he stepped forward, broad-shouldered in the way of men who work with their bodies every day without thinking about it, with dark hair that was longer than was fashionable, and a jaw that carried 3 or 4 days of growth in a way that was less a choice than an oversight. He had the kind of dark eyes that registered things quickly, eyes that moved over her face and her horse and her posture and her hands in about 2 seconds, and then settled back on her face with a focus that was direct without being rude. He was wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and there was a long smear of something that looked like axle grease along his right forearm, and he held the door with one hand and looked at her with an expression that was equal parts surprise and something more guarded underneath. "Help you?" he said. "My name is Jennie Townsend," she said. Clara Delaney told me you might be in need of a housekeeper and someone to keep your accounts. I am looking for a position of that kind." He looked at her for a moment that stretched past comfortable without quite reaching rude. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. "Mind the boot by the door." She minded the boot by the door, which was a very large boot sitting in the middle of the entry hall, in a position that suggested it had been there a while and had not been moved with any intention, and she stepped around it and followed him through the hall and into the kitchen, which was exactly the state that Clara's description had suggested it would be. There were dishes that had been washed but not put away, sitting in a pile on the counter with the good intentions of a man who had gotten distracted. There was a flour sack that had been left open. There was a coffee pot on the stove that looked like it had not been cleaned in some time. The table was clear at least, and the floor had been swept recently, which suggested that whoever was failing at the kitchen was at least making a genuine attempt. Frank Hawkins pulled out a chair at the table and gestured toward it, and Jennie sat down, and he sat down across from her and folded his hands on the table and looked at her with those dark, direct eyes. "Where are you from?" he asked. "Concho County most recently," she said. "Before that, Missouri." "You come alone?" "Yes." He took that in without visible reaction. "You have done this kind of work before." "I have run a household," she said, "and kept the accounts for a cattle operation. My late husband and I worked 200 acres in Concho County for 3 years. I can cook, preserve, mend, keep books, and I am not afraid of hard work." "Your late husband," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, not pity exactly, but a careful kind of acknowledgement. "I am sorry for your loss." "Thank you," she said, with the steadiness she had practiced until it was almost real. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the kitchen window, she could see 2 men working near the barn, and the sound of cattle carried on the morning air. "The position would include room and board," he said. "The room is upstairs, the one at the end of the hall. It is small but clean enough. I cannot offer a great deal in the way of wages right now because I have had a difficult season, but I can offer fair compensation and will increase it as things improve. I do not drink in excess and I do not make trouble. My men, Caldwell and Rays, are respectful and they keep to themselves." "That is reasonable," Jennie said. "I will be honest with you about the accounts," he said. "They are a mess. My last person kept them in a system I have not been able to fully understand, and I am not naturally a man of numbers. I manage the cattle and the land well enough, but the paper side of things has gotten away from me." "I can manage paper," Jennie said. He looked at her for another of those stretching moments, and then something in his expression shifted slightly. Some tension that had been holding itself carefully in place relaxed by a small but visible degree. "Can you start Monday?" he asked. "I can start today," Jennie said. He almost smiled. It was not a full smile, more like the place where a smile had considered happening and then stopped just short of it. But it changed his face in an interesting way, softened the angles of it, gave it something that was almost warm. "Today, then," he said. "I will show you around." She moved her things from Clara's boarding house that same afternoon, the 2 bags that contained everything she owned and the box that held her few books and the small wooden case with Daniel's letters in it. And she settled into the small room at the end of the upstairs hall that was indeed small and was indeed clean enough, with a window that faced east and would catch the morning light, and a narrow bed with a good blanket, and a chair in the corner where she could sit and read in the evenings. The watch went on the bedside table, as it always did when she was still at last, and she looked at it before she turned the lamp down that first night in the way she always looked at it before she slept. Silver-cased, delicately engraved, perfectly closed, the brass latch catching the lamplight in a small bright point. She did not open it. The first weeks at the Hawkins ranch passed with the quality of new beginnings, which is to say they were full of small adjustments and discoveries, and the particular awkwardness of 2 people learning the geography of each other's presence. Frank Hawkins was a man who moved through his own house with the efficiency of someone who spent as little time in it as possible, which was not because he was unfond of it, but because his work was outside, and had been entirely outside for so long that the house had become merely a place where he ate and slept and occasionally sat in the evenings with a book or a glass of water, not a place where he truly lived. He was up before dawn every day and out the door before the sky had fully decided to be light, and he came in at midday for a meal if the work allowed it, and at evening for supper, and he was quiet at meals in the way of someone who is comfortable with silence rather than someone who has nothing to say. Jennie appreciated this. She was not a woman who needed to fill silences, and she had found, in the time since Daniel's death, that most silences were preferable to most conversations, at least until you knew a person well enough to trust them with the real things. She worked on the house with a methodical thoroughness that felt, in those first weeks, like something close to relief. There was a satisfaction in the physical act of bringing order to things, in scrubbing the kitchen clean and organizing the pantry and finding the system of the house and making it function properly. She worked on the accounts in the afternoons, when the midday heat was at its worst and working outside was not practical, sitting at the desk in the front room with the ledgers spread before her and the quiet of the house around her, and she found that the accounts, while genuinely disordered, were not beyond recovery. Frank Hawkins had been right that he was not naturally a man of numbers, but he had kept receipts and records, imperfectly but consistently, and with those as her raw material, she was able to reconstruct a reasonably clear picture of where things stood. Where things stood was not as bad as she had feared, though it required careful management. The season had indeed been difficult, as he had said, with a dry spring that had hurt the grazing and a bout of illness in the herd that had cost him a quarter of his yearlings. But the land was good, and the remaining cattle were healthy, and the debt against the property was manageable if payments were met consistently, which she judged they could be if things went as planned through the fall. She told him all of this one evening in October, about 3 weeks after she had arrived, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with the ledgers between them and the lamp burning between them, casting a warm pool of light over the columns of numbers. He listened with the focused attention of a man who was learning something he had not known he needed to know, asking questions that were precise and showed he understood more than he had let on, making notes in his cramped, left-leaning handwriting in the margins of the ledger. When she finished explaining, he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a moment. "So we are not as far gone as I thought," he said. "No," she said, "not if you are careful through the winter." "I can be careful through the winter," he said. And then, after a pause, "Thank you, I mean that. I have been carrying this around in my head for months and not understanding it clearly, and it has been a weight I did not know how to set down." Jennie looked at him across the table. In the lamplight, his face had a different quality than in the daylight, less guarded, more open, the edges of his expression softened by the warm light and the absence of the immediate demands of the day. "You are a good rancher," she said, because it was true, and because she thought he might not hear it often enough. "The cattle are in excellent condition, and the land is being worked intelligently. You simply need someone to manage the paper side of things." "I need someone to manage the paper side of things," he agreed, and he said it with the wry, understated quality that she was beginning to recognize as his particular version of humor, the kind that arrived quietly and without announcement, and left a small, warm trace behind it. It was around this time that Frank Hawkins first noticed the watch. He saw it for the first time on a morning in late October when he came downstairs earlier than usual and found Jennie already in the kitchen, standing at the stove with her back to him, moving the coffee pot to the better burner with one hand while her other hand rested at her side, closed around something small, something she held with a particular quality of unconscious care, the way you hold something precious without thinking about it, because holding it has become as natural as breathing. She did not hear him on the stairs, and he stopped in the doorway for just a moment, not meaning to observe her, simply pausing because he had not expected to find her there quite yet. And in that moment, he saw her open her right hand and look down at whatever she held, and then close her fingers around it again and turn back to the stove with an expression he could not entirely read from where he stood, something composed but carrying weight beneath its composure. He stepped into the kitchen and she heard him then and turned with the professional ease of someone who is used to managing their own expressions under observation. "Good morning," she said. "Coffee is nearly ready." "Good morning," he said, and he crossed to the table and sat down, and he did not ask about what she had been holding, because it was not his place to ask and because he had the instinct, which was correct, that it was not a thing she would tell him easily or soon. But he noticed it after that. He noticed it without intending to, the way you notice things that catch at something in you even when you would rather not be caught. He saw her reach into her apron pocket and close her hand around it without looking, the way you reach for something you know exactly where it is without needing to look. He saw it on the bedside table once, passing the open door of her room with a load of fence posts from the barn, just a glimpse of silver against the dark wood. He saw her take it out and hold it on a Sunday afternoon when she thought she was alone on the porch, sitting in one of the rocking chairs with the watch resting in her open palm, looking at it the way you look at something you are not seeing, seeing something else entirely. He was not a man who pushed at things that were not offered to him. He had lived long enough and lost enough of his own to understand that there are things people carry that they are not ready to set down, and that the most respectful thing you can do for a person in that situation is simply be present without demanding access to whatever it is. So he watched, and he noticed, and he asked nothing. November came in cool and bright, the kind of weather that made the plains beautiful in a stark and serious way, the grass gone tawny, and the sky a clean hard blue that stretched to every edge. The work on the ranch settled into the rhythm of the late season, the preparations for winter, the mending of fence lines and the laying in of supplies, and the decisions about which cattle to sell before the weather turned difficult. Jennie went with Frank and his hands, Caldwell and Ray's, to the market at Redrock twice that month, sitting on the wagon seat beside Frank while he drove, managing the sales records and the accounting on site. And she found that this was the kind of work she was good at and did not mind doing, the active, practical management of real things in the real world. Caldwell was a taciturn man in his 40s who had been working cattle his whole adult life and had the kind of weathered competence that needs no advertisement. Ray's was younger, somewhere in his mid-20s, quick-handed and easy-laughing, the son of a Mexican family from south of the Rio Grande who had been working for Frank for 3 years, and clearly liked him with the uncomplicated loyalty of a person who has found a fair employer and appreciated the rarity of it. Both of them were respectful to Jennie from the first day, as Frank had said they would be, and she settled into an easy working relationship with them both. It was Ray's who mentioned the Donovan situation, on a cold November afternoon when they were mending the south fence line and Jennie had brought coffee out to them in the tin pot wrapped in a cloth to keep it warm. "Donovan was in town yesterday," Ray said, not to anyone in particular, accepting his cup from Jennie with a nod of thanks. Frank, who was driving a staple into a post with economical precision, did not turn around. What did he want? "Talking to Henderson at the bank," Ray said, "asking questions about the parcel that runs along our eastern boundary." Frank turned around then and looked at Ray's with the expression of a man receiving information he had been half expecting but not welcoming. "Henderson should not be talking to anyone about our accounts," he said. "He might not have said much, but Donovan does not ask questions without a reason." Jennie had heard of Donovan in town, the way you heard of things in small places, in pieces and oblique references that assembled into a picture over time. His name was Wade Donovan, and he ran the largest cattle operation in the county by some margin, a man who had expanded his landholdings steadily over the past decade through a combination of genuine business acumen and methods that some people in Redrock spoke of carefully and others spoke of not at all. He had made approaches to Frank about buying the eastern parcel before, twice that she knew of from things Frank had mentioned in passing, and twice Frank had declined. "He is looking to see if you are in a position where you might need to sell," Jennie said. Frank looked at her. "That is my read," he said. "Then we make sure you are not," she said. "The accounts are in better shape than they were. If we sell the 10 head you had earmarked for January now, while the prices are still good, and use that to make the December and January payments to the bank in advance, you will not be behind, and Donovan will not be able to go to Henderson with a story about your financial position." Frank looked at her for a long moment with those dark, direct eyes, and something moved through his expression that she was beginning to learn was his version of being impressed, which was not a demonstrative thing, just a slight shift, a quality of focused attention becoming something warmer. "You thought about this already," he said. "Think about it all the time," she said. "It is my job to think about it." "It is your job," he agreed, "but you do not have to make it your concern the way you have." She did not know quite what to say to that. She looked away from him, out over the fence line toward the eastern boundary in question, the flat country rolling away toward a line of low hills that were blue in the afternoon light. "I like this ranch," she said, which was simpler than the whole of what she meant. "I would like to see it do well." He did not say anything else about it then, but that evening after supper, when she had cleared the table and was making her way to the stairs, he said from the kitchen where he was still sitting, not looking up from the ledger she had left there for him, "Thank you, Jennie." It was the first time he had used her given name rather than Mrs. Townsend. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed and took the watch from her apron pocket and held it in both hands. It was cold outside the pocket, as it always was when she first took it out, and she warmed it between her palms out of habit. Silver, hoarse, brass latch. The silence of a stopped mechanism inside. She turned it over once, twice, running her thumb along the familiar contours of the engraving. She thought about what it would mean to open it. She had thought about this many times in 2 years, had come close on certain evenings when the loneliness was very bad, had held it with her thumb against the latch and then not pressed it and put it away again. She was not sure exactly what she was afraid of finding inside. She knew what was inside. It was a watch face, a set of hands pointing at the time when it had stopped, which was sometime in the middle of the night of the day Daniel died, because no one had wound it after that and it had run down in the days of her grief, and she had not noticed the exact moment when it stopped. What she was afraid of, she thought, was not the watch face. It was the clock hands pointing at a time, a specific, fixed, irrevocable time, as if the world had been stopped at that moment and she would have to look at the evidence of the stopping. She kept the watch closed to keep the moment inside from becoming real in the particular way that looking at things makes them real. As long as the watch was closed, Daniel was not stopped at any specific hour. He was simply absent. The world had continued forward and taken her with it, and the closed watch was the one place where time had not been fixed and nailed down and made irrefutable. She understood that this was not entirely rational. She understood this was grief doing what grief does, finding small structures to inhabit because the grief itself is too large to look at directly. But understanding a thing and being ready to let it go are different things entirely, and she was not yet ready. She put the watch on the table and turned the lamp down and lay back against the pillow and listened to the wind moving around the eaves of the house, the sound of the plains at night, which was sometimes lonely and sometimes just simply beautiful and sometimes both at once. December came and with it the advance payments to the bank, which had exactly the effect Jennie had predicted, leaving the Hawkins ranch in a sound position that gave Donovan nothing to work with at the bank. He came himself one afternoon, riding up the main road in the company of 2 of his men, a big man with a well-cut coat, and a face that had the practiced pleasantness of someone who had made pleasantness into a business tool. He spoke with Frank at the front gate for about 20 minutes, and Jennie, who was working at the front room desk with a clear line of sight to the gate, watched through the window without appearing to watch. She could not hear what was said, but she could read the quality of the conversation in the posture of the 2 men. Donovan's posture was expansive and easy, the posture of a man making an offer he expected to be taken. Frank's posture was the one she had come to know, upright, still, courteous in the external form of it, not yielding in the substance of it. At one point Donovan gestured toward the house, and Frank's attention followed the gesture. And for a moment Frank was looking directly at the window, though not at her in particular, just toward the house. Then Frank shook his head once, with the finality of a man who has made up his mind and is done discussing it. And Donovan's pleasant face shifted through something briefly less pleasant before resettling into its public configuration. They shook hands with the formal courtesy of men who are opponents dressed up as neighbors, and Donovan and his riders went back down the road the way they had come. Frank came inside, hung his coat on the hook by the door, and walked through the hall to the front room where Jennie was sitting. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and she put her pen down and looked at him. "He offered to buy the whole spread," Frank said, "not just the eastern parcel." Jennie was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell him?" "I told him it was not for sale." He looked at her steadily. "He suggested that I might not be in a financial position to be so particular." "He is wrong about that," Jennie said. "I told him so," Frank said. "He seemed to be aware that something had changed in our position, but he did not know the specifics. He was fishing." His expression, which had been very controlled during this recounting, shifted slightly. "He also made a comment about my household arrangement." Jennie looked at him carefully. "What kind of comment?" Frank's jaw tightened briefly and then relaxed. "The kind of comment that was intended to be offensive and was." I did not respond to it as he perhaps hoped I would. She understood. A single woman working in a single man's house, in 1878, in a small frontier town where people had long memories and active imaginations. She had understood the social geography of this situation from the beginning and had navigated it with the care it deserved, which was to say she had been proper and professional and had not given anyone anything to work with. But there were people, she knew, who did not need to be given things, who would simply invent them if they were useful. "It does not bother me," she said, which was mostly true. "People will think what they will think." "It bothered me," Frank said, with a quiet directness that was more revealing than he perhaps intended. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the moment held something in it that neither of them quite reached for, and then Frank said he had to check on the cattle, and he went, and Jennie sat at the desk for a moment longer before she went back to the ledger, but she did not pick up her pen right away. Christmas came to the Hawkins ranch without great ceremony, but with a warmth that Jennie had not expected. Clara Delaney came out for Christmas dinner, along with Caldwell and Rays and the pastor from the small church, Reverend Birch, who was a gentle, bookish man who had somehow ended up in the frontier and made his peace with it. Frank had acquired a small fir tree from somewhere, which he had set up in the front room with a kind of sheepish determination, and Jennie had made decorations for it from ribbon and small bits of gilded paper she had found in the bottom of the stationery box, and the effect was modest and genuine and entirely lovely in the way that modest, genuine things often are. After dinner, when the others were settled in the front room with their coffee, and Clara was telling a story that required a great deal of dramatic pause for maximum effect, Frank found himself standing beside Jennie in the kitchen doorway, both of them leaning slightly against opposite sides of the frame, looking through at the gathered people with the warm, outside-of-it-all feeling of two people who are both capable of enjoying a thing from a slight remove. "Good Christmas," Frank said, quietly, not making it a question. "Very good," Jennie said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I am glad you came here, Mrs. Townsend. Jennie, I am glad you are here." She turned her head to look at him, and he was looking at the room, not at her. But there was something in his profile that was open in the way faces are open when someone says something true that they have not planned to say. "I am glad too," she said. He looked at her then, and their eyes met in that quiet doorway. And there was something between them that was neither quite friendship nor quite something else. A warmth that had been building without announcement for 2 months, that had no specific name yet, but was real, was present, was growing. Clara Delaney, in the front room, reached the punchline of her story, and everyone laughed, and the moment folded gently into the noise of the room. January brought cold that was serious about itself, the kind of cold that got into the bones of the land and stayed there. Jennie spent more time indoors during the worst weeks, working on the accounts and the mending and the preserves she was putting up from the root cellar stores. And Frank came in from the cold at midday, and at evening smelling of frost and cattle and the outdoors in winter. And they ate together at the kitchen table with the stove throwing good heat and talked, in the way of two people who have gotten comfortable enough with each other for conversation to come easily. She learned things about him in those conversations, the way you learn things about people when the conversation is allowed to happen naturally rather than being managed. She learned that he had grown up in Tennessee, the fourth of 5 children, that he had come west at 20 after his father's farm was lost to debt, that he had spent 3 years working as a cowhand on various spreads through Texas and New Mexico before he had saved enough to stake his own claim on the land where they now sat. She learned that he had lost a younger brother, Thomas, to a fall from a horse 3 years before, and that this loss had changed him in ways he could describe only obliquely, as something that had made the air around him thinner for a while, harder to breathe. She told him things too, though she told them more carefully and in smaller pieces, the way a person who has been hurt releases information, testing each disclosure to see if it is safe before offering the next. She told him about Daniel, about the cattle operation in Concho County, about the 3 years of hard work and the surprising happiness she had found in that hard work, about the fever and the 9 days and the Tuesday in the spring when it was over. He listened to these things the way he listened to everything fully, without interrupting, with those dark eyes steady on her face. One evening in the middle of January, the coldest week, with ice on the water bucket in the morning and the wind so sharp it felt personal, they were sitting in the front room after supper, Frank on one side of the fireplace with his book, and Jennie on the other side with her mending. And the fire was going well, and the room was warm, and the outside was very dark and quiet. Jennie set the mending down in her lap for a moment and reached into her apron pocket without thinking and took out the watch and held it, as she always did, running her thumb across the silver case. She became aware of Frank watching her. She did not look up immediately. She turned the watch over once in her hand, the familiar motion, and then she looked up and met his eyes, and he held her gaze steadily, not looking away with the apologetic speed of someone who has been caught staring, but looking back at her with an open, quiet attention. "What is it?" he asked. It was a simple question, asked without pressure or urgency, asked the way you would ask it of someone you trusted enough to ask. She looked down at the watch in her hands. "It was Daniel's," she said. "His father gave it to him. He carried it every day." Frank was quiet, waiting. "He left it on the bedside table the night he died," she said. "He always took it off when he slept because the ticking kept him from sleeping deep, and the next morning it was there and I picked it up and I have not put it down since." "You carry it with you always," Frank said, not a question, a recognition. He had seen enough to know this was true. "Every day," she said. He looked at her hands, at the closed watch resting in them. "You do not open it," he said, and this was also not a question. She was quiet for a long moment. The fire popped, sending a small bright spray of sparks against the grate. "No," she said, "I have not opened it." He did not ask why immediately. He sat with this for a while, and she appreciated him for that, for not rushing at the question, for letting the silence have its proper weight. "May I ask why?" he said, after the fire had settled back to its steady burn. She looked at the watch. She looked at Frank. He was watching her with an expression that was entirely without judgment, entirely without the eager pity that she had come to dread from people who wanted to help her with her grief in ways that mostly did not help. He was simply asking. He was simply present. He had the face of a man who could hold whatever she told him and would not drop it, and so she told him. "When the watch stopped," she said slowly, It stopped at some time in the night. I do not know what time. The hands are fixed at that moment. And as long as I do not open it, I do not know the exact time, and the exact time remains something I do not have to carry. But if I open it, the hands will be pointing at a specific hour and a specific minute, and that moment will be real in the way that fixed things are real, and Daniel will be gone at that particular time on that particular night, and I will have to know it. She paused. I know this is not rational. It is not about being rational, Frank said. No, she said. It is not. You have been carrying that watch for 2 years, he said. 2 years, 4 months, and some days, she said. He was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved around the house outside. The fire breathed. What would you need, he said, and his voice was very careful, very gentle, to be ready to open it. She looked at him. No one had asked her that before. People had told her she should open it, should let herself mourn properly, should face it and move through it. No one had thought to ask what she herself would need. I do not know, she said honestly. I think I need to be somewhere where the opening of it does not feel like loss. I think I need the world to feel like something is still possible, even after. He looked at her for a long moment, and what she saw in his face, in those dark, steady eyes, was not pity and not urgency, and not the awkward kindness of someone who did not know what to do with what she had told him. What she saw was something simpler and more honest than any of that. What she saw was that he understood her, that he was carrying his own version of the same kind of thing, the brother who fell, the engagement that did not come to anything, the 8 years of building this ranch and keeping the world at a slightly formal distance, and that the understanding between them in this moment was real and mutual and mattered. I think I understand that, he said quietly. She put the watch back in her pocket. They sat on either side of the fire for a while longer, each with their own thoughts, and the comfortable silence between them had shifted into something richer, something that had been given more of its true content, and it was a good kind of silence, the kind that comes after something true has been said. February brought a thaw in the 3rd week, sudden and welcome, the kind of midwinter reprieve that makes you believe in spring before you should. On one of the warm afternoons, Jennie came out to the garden on the south side of the house that had been surrendered to neglect, and she stood looking at it for a while, assessing. It was not as far gone as she had first judged. The soil was good, she could tell that much from the color and the texture, and the structure of the beds was still there under the weeds, and there were the dead stalks of what had once been healthy tomato plants and some straggly lavender that had survived despite the neglect. She got a hoe from the barn and began clearing the nearest bed. Frank came around the side of the house 2 hours later and stopped when he saw her. You do not have to do that, he said. I know, she said, not stopping. I want to. He stood there for a moment, watching, and then he said, let me get a spade, and went back to the barn and came back with a spade and began working the next bed over, and they worked together through the rest of the afternoon without talking much, just the sound of tools and earth and the occasional direction from Jennie about what was worth saving and what was not. It was, Jennie thought, as the sun went lower, and the air began to cool toward evening again, one of the nicest afternoons she had spent in a long time. There was something specific about working alongside someone in a shared project that was different from simply being in the same place, something that had a quality of partnership to it that she had been missing without quite articulating the missing. She glanced at Frank across the beds they had cleared, where he was driving the spade into a particularly stubborn root system with the methodical patience of a man who does not hurry unnecessarily. And she felt something that she had not let herself feel in 2 years, a warmth that was not grief and not loneliness, and was not the professional satisfaction of work well done, a warmth that was specifically about him, about this particular man in this particular place on this particular afternoon. She looked away and went back to hoeing. In March, she planted the garden. She ordered seeds from the catalog and planted them with the careful optimism of someone who is committing to a future, lettuce and carrots and beans and tomatoes, and the herbs she had been missing since Concho County. Frank watched her do this from the porch one morning, drinking his coffee with both hands around the cup, and there was something in his face she could not quite read and did not press at. That same month, she wrote a letter to her sister in Missouri, the first letter in longer than she wanted to admit, and in the letter she described the ranch and the work and Redrock and Clara Delaney and the garden, and at the end she wrote, almost without planning to, that she had begun to feel, for the first time since Daniel died, that the world was still a place where things could be all right. She did not write about Frank specifically, but she thought about him while she wrote, and she thought that some things were too new and too private to put into letters yet. Spring arrived, and with it the full press of ranch work, the branding and the calving and the fence repairs that had accumulated over winter. Jennie took on more of the outdoor coordination as the season intensified, riding between the work parties with the day's instructions and the supply counts, managing the logistics of the operation with the same organized efficiency she brought to everything. Frank had begun to genuinely rely on her for this, not just the accounts but the whole running of the place, and she had come to understand the ranch's rhythms and needs with the intimacy you only get from close attention over time. One afternoon in late April, she was riding back to the main house from the eastern fence line when her horse, a reliable brown mare named Bess that belonged to the ranch, shied suddenly at a jackrabbit that exploded from the grass, and Jennie was not quite ready for it, was slightly off balance from turning to look at something behind her, and came off the saddle. She landed in the grass and did not land badly, her shoulder taking most of it, and she was up almost immediately, shaken but not seriously hurt, catching Bess's reins before the horse could bolt. She checked herself over with the practical assessment of a person who has had a few falls in their life and knows the difference between hurt and hurt badly. Her shoulder was sore and would be more sore by evening, and her pride was injured, and those were the extent of the casualties. But Frank had seen it. He had been working not far away with Caldwell, and he came at a run that he probably should not have bothered with given that she was already standing and holding the horse when he arrived, his face carrying an expression she had not seen on him before, open and urgent and not at all guarded. "Jennie," he said, arriving beside her, his hands going to her arms with a directness that surprised him as much as it surprised her. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said. "My shoulder a little. I am all right." He looked at her with that urgent, open expression for a moment longer than the situation required, given that she was clearly standing and conscious and already assessing the situation calmly. His hands were still on her arms. Then some awareness of the fact of his hands seemed to reach him, and he stepped back slightly, though not entirely, not far enough to pretend the moment had not happened. "You should let Dr. Mercer look at the shoulder," he said, his voice back to its normal measured quality but with something underneath it that had not quite settled. "It is a bruise," she said. "I have had worse." "Humor me," he said. She went to see Dr. Mercer, who confirmed that it was a bruise, a significant one that would be spectacular in its coloring for the next week or so, and told her to rest the arm and not lift heavy things, which was advice she followed with about 50% fidelity. That evening, Frank knocked on the door of her room. She opened it, and he was standing in the hall with an expression of someone who has prepared something to say and is now reconsidering the preparation. "I wanted to make sure you were comfortable," he said. "I am," she said. "Thank you." He stood there a moment longer than the situation required. "I was frightened," he said then simply as if this were an ordinary thing to say. "When I saw you fall, I was frightened for you." Jennie looked at him in the hall, the lamp in her hand casting a warm light over his face. "I know," she said, because she had seen it in his face when he ran to her, and she did not want to pretend she had not. He looked at her with those dark, direct eyes, and there was so much in the look that she felt the warmth of it from across the threshold. He was a man, she had come to understand over these months, who did not say things he did not mean, who measured his words with the care of someone who understood their weight, and what he had just said was simple and true and revealing. "Good night, Jennie," he said. "Good night, Frank," she said. He went down the hall and she closed the door and stood with her back against it for a moment, the lamp warm in her hand, and the watch warm in her apron pocket, and something was happening in her chest that was not grief, was not the ache of absence, was its opposite, was the particular and terrifying and hopeful feeling of something beginning. May came and the garden was growing, and the ranch was deep into its busy season, and Jennie had been at the Hawkins ranch for 7 months. She was riding out with Frank more often now, the two of them on horseback going over the range to assess the cattle or check the water sources or survey the fence lines. And these rides had become something she looked forward to with an honesty she was beginning to stop arguing with. Frank was good company on horseback, easy and observant, pointing out things she would not have noticed on her own, the sign of a particular kind of grass that indicated good soil moisture, the way a certain cloud formation over the hills meant weather by evening, the small pleasures of the land he had been working for 8 years, and clearly loved with the uncomplicated depth of someone who had made a true home in a place. On a morning in mid-May, they rode to the eastern boundary of the property to check on a section of fence that Rays had flagged as needing attention, and when they reached it, they found that it did need attention, but also that the land beyond it was extraordinarily beautiful on this particular morning, the light coming in low and golden over the hills, the grass still bright with dew, a stand of live oaks along the fence line casting good shade. They tied the horses and Frank assessed the fence, and Jennie stood at the line and looked at the country beyond. "This is what Donovan wants," she said. "Among other things," Frank said, testing a wire's tension. "Would you ever sell it?" "If you were in a different position." He looked up from the fence. "No," he said without hesitation. "What do you want to do with it?" He came and stood beside her at the fence line, looking out at the country Donovan coveted. He was quiet for a moment. "Expand," he said. "Build the herd back to what it should be. Eventually I would like to put some acreage under cultivation, not just grass. There is good soil in the low ground by the creek." He paused. "I would like this to be a place that lasts. Something that does not get swallowed up." She heard the loneliness in that without him saying it directly, the vision of something lasting that required not just work and competence but also, eventually, other people, continuity, a future that extended beyond one person's single efforts. "You will do it," she said. He turned his head and looked at her, and what she saw in his face in the slanted morning light was something that had moved past the careful guardedness that had characterized the early months and settled into something more genuinely open, a face that had decided, somewhere along the way, that she was worth showing itself to. "I think I might," he said, and the way he said it made clear that her being there was part of what he was thinking about when he said it. She looked back at the country beyond the fence, and her hand went to her apron pocket, as it always did, and closed around the watch. Frank's eyes followed the movement, and when she looked back at him, he was looking at her hand in her pocket with a quietness that said he remembered everything she had told him in January, the watch and what it held, and why she kept it closed. "I think I might be ready soon," she said. It surprised her that she said it. She had not planned to say it. It simply came out of her, the truth of it reaching her mouth before her caution could intercept it. Frank looked at her face. "The watch?" he asked softly. She nodded. He did not push it, did not suggest she do it now, did not offer to be there for it in a way that would have felt intrusive. He simply nodded the way he had nodded at the news in January, steady and present. "When you are ready," he said. They fixed the fence together, he working the wire and she holding the post, and they rode home in the middle morning with the sun at their backs, and the ranch spread out before them as they came over the last rise. And Jennie thought that 7 months ago she had driven a listing wagon into Redrock with everything she owned and nothing she hoped for. And now here she was on this land in this morning light, and something had happened to her that she had not been looking for and had not expected and was not sure yet what to do with. And the name of it was Frank Hawkins, and the feeling of it was like the first morning in spring when the air is genuinely warm again, and you realize, with a Surprise that is also a relief, that you had been cold for a long time and had gotten used to it. June came with heat and work and the particular joy of the garden, which was flourishing in a way that delighted Jennie every morning when she looked at it. The tomatoes were coming in, and the beans were heavy on their vines, and the lavender was blooming in a long purple line along the south wall of the house, and the whole place had a smell in the evenings, after watering, of something green and alive and tended. It was on an evening in late June that Clara Delaney came to dinner, as she did from time to time, and sat at the kitchen table with her sharp, kind eyes moving between Frank and Jennie with the expression of a woman who is not saying everything she is seeing. And after dinner, she asked Jennie to walk with her to the garden before she went home. They walked in the evening light among the tomato plants, and Clara looked at the garden with approval, and at Jennie with something that was more than approval. "You are well," Clara said. It was not quite a question. "I am well," Jennie said. Clara was quiet for a moment, deadheading a spent flower from the lavender with the absent efficiency of a gardener. "He is a good man," Clara said. Jennie looked at the tomatoes. "I know," she said. "He has been a lonely man," Clara said. "He does not show it because he is not a man who makes a public exhibition of his inner states. But I have known him 8 years, and I know the difference between a man who is solitary because he prefers it and a man who is solitary because circumstances have made him so." She paused. "He has been the second kind." "He told me about the engagement," Jennie said. "Did he?" Clara said, which indicated this was not something he often discussed. "Then he trusts you considerably." Jennie did not respond to this directly, and Clara, who was wise enough to know when to stop pressing, let it rest, and they walked back to the porch where Frank was waiting with Clara's horse and the lantern she would need for the road. And Clara embraced Jennie with the unself-conscious warmth of a woman who had decided she was family, and then climbed on her horse with the vigor of someone who had been climbing on horses for 60 years and would for 60 more. Frank and Jennie stood on the porch and watched her go, the lantern bobbing down the road and growing small in the darkness, and then Frank said something she had not expected. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I am telling it to you plainly because I think you deserve plain dealing, and I have been trying to find the right time, and I have come to the conclusion that there is no right time. There is just the time when you say it." Jennie turned to look at him. He was looking at the road where Clara's lantern had disappeared into the dark. "I have feelings for you, Jennie," he said. "I am not going to pretend otherwise or dress it up in a lot of language. I think you know, and I think you have known for a while, and I have not said it because I did not want to put any kind of pressure on you when you are still making your way through things. And I am still not pressing you for anything. I just did not want to keep not saying it." The porch was very quiet. The night was full of the sounds of summer, crickets and a light wind, and somewhere far away the lowing of cattle, and the sky above was enormous and perfectly clear and thick with stars, the way the Texas sky is on summer nights. Jennie looked at him. He had turned to look at her now, and his face was open in the way that faces are open when the person has decided to be fully honest and is simply waiting to see what happens with it. "I know," she said, "and I have feelings for you too. I have been knowing it for a while, and I have been taking my time with it because I needed to take my time." "I know you have," he said. "I am still taking my time," she said, "but I wanted you to know that it is not absent. What I feel, it is very much present." He looked at her for a long moment, and then something moved across his face, not the almost smile of the early weeks, but a real one, warm and unguarded, the face of a man who has been given something he was not sure he would be given. "That is enough," he said. "That is more than enough." They stood there on the porch a while longer, not touching, not needing to yet, simply standing together under the enormous summer sky, and Jennie had the feeling that something was being built, carefully and without rushing, the way the house they stood in front of had been built, with attention and intention, and the belief that the thing being made was worth making to last. July and August were the hottest months, and the heat settled over the ranch with a seriousness that required respect. The work continued because it had to continue, but it was paced differently in the heat, with the hardest outdoor labor done in the early morning and the evening, and the midday hours protected where possible. Frank had taken to sitting on the porch in the evenings after supper, and Jennie had taken to sitting there too, and the conversations that happened in those evening hours, in the cooling air with the sky turning through its colors above the plains, were some of the best conversations she had ever had. They talked about everything, about the land and the cattle and the garden and the account books, about Tennessee and Missouri and the things that had made them who they were. About books, because they were both readers, and about the territory and its politics, the disputes over land and water rights that were reshaping the region, the ongoing conflicts between the cattle ranchers and the encroaching farmers who were coming with their barbed wire, and their different vision of what the land should be used for. About Daniel, on certain evenings when she was able to speak of him, and about Thomas, on the evenings when Frank was willing, and about grief and how it changed its shape over time without ever fully disappearing. On an evening in mid-August, Jennie came out to the porch after washing the supper dishes and found Frank sitting in one of the rocking chairs with something in his hands, and it took her a moment to understand what she was looking at, and when she understood, her breath stopped briefly. He had found a small silver watch somewhere, an old one, nothing like hers, a plain smooth case without engravings, clearly inexpensive and not working. He was not doing anything with it, just holding it, looking at it with an expression she could not quite read. He looked up when she appeared. "I found this in a box I was sorting through," he said. "It was Thomas's. He won it in a card game when he was 17 and he was very proud of it, and it never worked properly, but he carried it anyway." He turned it over in his hands. "I have not been able to look at it for 3 years." She sat down in the chair beside him. The evening light was going gold and low. "Did you open it?" she asked. "Just now," he said. "Yes." "What did you find?" "A stopped face," he said. "The hands pointing at 4:47. He paused. "I do not even know if that was morning or evening. It could have stopped any time." He closed his hand around the watch. "It did not hurt the way I thought it would. It just made him real again, in the way things are real when you look at them." Jennie was quiet for a moment. "That is what I am afraid of," she said. "I know," he said, "but I think he is real whether you look at the hands or not, Jennie. I think you know where every minute of every hour of those 9 days went. The watch cannot tell you anything about Daniel that you do not already know." She sat with this for a long time. The light went lower. The first stars came out. "I think you might be right," she said finally. He looked at her with a gentleness that she had come to love specifically, the particular gentleness of this particular man, which was not soft, which was not the gentleness of someone who did not know how hard things were, but the gentleness of someone who knew exactly how hard things were and was steady in it anyway. "Whenever you are ready," he said. I meant that. September brought cooler air and a visit from Jennie's sister, who had read the letter from May and had written back, and then had simply appeared one afternoon on the stage from San Angelo. A woman named Ruth, who was 2 years younger than Jennie and had a husband in Missouri and 3 children, and the easy, chattering warmth of someone who has never found it difficult to be happy. Ruth looked at everything with the observant eyes of a fond sister, at the ranch and the garden and Clara Delaney's clear approval, and the way Jennie moved through the house with the familiarity of someone who has made a place her own. And then she looked at Frank with the particular attention of a sister evaluating a man on behalf of her sibling. Frank, to his credit, received this evaluation with patient courtesy. He was not uncomfortable around Ruth in the way of men who are unnerved by lively women. He simply occupied his own measure of space and did his work and was politely available when called upon for conversation. And Ruth, to her credit, reported her findings to Jennie on the second night of her visit with the directness that sisters use with each other. "He is half in love with you already," Ruth said. "He looks at you the way Daniel used to look at you, only Frank does it when he thinks you are not watching." "I know," Jennie said. "And you?" Ruth asked. "And me," Jennie said, which was enough for Ruth, who understood her sister's silences. "You have been alone a long time," Ruth said more gently. "I know," Jennie said. "Daniel would not have wanted this for you," Ruth said, using the past tense as casually as she always had because she was one of the few people who did not feel she had to be careful with it. The watch and the closed case and the carrying of things you do not open, he would have been troubled by it. Jennie looked at her hands. The watch was in her apron pocket. "I know that too," she said. "Are you going to open it?" "I think soon," Jennie said. "I think nearly." Ruth stayed for a week and left with the warmth and the slight disruption of a small wind that has passed through. And the house was quiet again after she went, but a good quiet, the kind that comes after something necessary has been said and settled. October came and turned the hills blue and the grass gold, and the evenings cold and sharp and beautiful. It had been exactly 1 year since Jennie Townsend had ridden up to the Hawkins ranch on a borrowed horse from Clara Delaney's boarding house and knocked on the front door and met the man who opened it. On the evening of the anniversary of that day, Frank came in from the barn at sunset and found Jennie in the kitchen, not cooking, not working, simply standing by the kitchen window with the watch open in her palm. She heard him come in and did not turn around. She was looking at the watch face, at the two hands, the hour hand pointing to 2 and the minute hand pointing to the cluster of marks around 23 minutes past, the hands that had been fixed at this position for 2 years and 7 months and some days. 2:23 in the morning, she thought, or the afternoon. But she knew, with the quiet certainty that had come to her when she pressed the latch and the case sprang open, that it had been the morning. 2:23 in the morning of the day after Daniel died. She knew because she had been awake at 2 and had looked in on him and the light was on, and he had still been breathing, labored and wrong but breathing, and she had gone back to bed. And somewhere in those 23 minutes after 2 he had gone. She had not been there and she had spent 2 years not knowing the specific moment, and now she knew it and she held it. She heard Frank stop in the kitchen doorway. She turned around. He saw the open watch in her palm and he understood immediately, and his face did the thing it did when something important happened. It went very still and very present, and the guard came all the way down. "Jennie," he said softly. 2:23, she said. He was still there at 2, gone by 2:23. She paused. "I was asleep." "You could not have known," Frank said. "No," she said, "I could not have." She looked at the watch face. "It is strange. I thought it would be worse, but it is just a time. It is just 2 hands on a face. And Daniel is still exactly who he was, and nothing about looking at this changes any of what he was to me." She closed the watch gently, the case clicking shut with a small, clear sound. "I think I have been afraid of the wrong thing for 2 years. Frank crossed the kitchen to her. He stood very close, looking at her with the open, full attention expression that was his most honest face. He reached out and took her free hand in both of his, and she let him. "What made you ready?" he asked. "Today," she looked at him. 1 year, she thought. 1 year of this man, and this ranch, and this garden, and this feeling that the world was still a place where things could be all right. 1 year of Frank Hawkins being exactly who he was every single day, without pretense, without pressure, with the steady, patient, genuine care of someone who had decided she was worth being patient for. "You did," she said. "This place, this year." She paused. "You specifically." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he did the thing she had been half anticipating and half not for months. He lifted the hand he was holding and pressed it against his chest, over his heart, and held it there, and the gesture was so direct and so simple and so completely him that she felt it in her own chest like a bell struck. "I love you, Jennie," he said. "I want to be very clear about that, in case anything I have been doing for the past year has been unclear on the subject." She felt something happening in her face that she recognized, with a start, as the particular kind of tears that are not grief but their opposite, and she said, "It has been quite clear." And he smiled then, fully, without reservation, the smile she had been watching approach for 12 months, and that was, now that it arrived completely, absolutely worth every bit of the waiting. She stepped forward and he wrapped his arms around her, and she put her head against his shoulder and felt the solid warmth of him and breathed. and the watch was in her pocket, closed and carried, and finally at peace. And something that had been bound for 2 years and 7 months released itself quietly in her chest and simply let go. They stood in the kitchen in the fading October light and held each other, and neither of them said anything else for a long while, because there was nothing that needed to be said that was not already being said. In November, Frank asked her to marry him. He did it without ceremony in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, coming in from the cattle work with his coat still on and finding her at the desk in the front room with the accounts spread around her and standing in the doorway until she looked up. "Marry me," he said. "I would like you to marry me, and I would like to be very clear that this is not an impulsive request. I have been thinking about it since February." She put her pen down. "February," she said. "February," he confirmed. "When you helped me clear the garden beds and then told me you liked this ranch, I thought, this is a woman I want to spend the rest of my life with." She looked at him across the front room. "Yes," she said. He breathed out, and she realized he had been holding his breath without knowing it, and that this had not been as effortlessly confident as he had made it appear. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said again, and she stood up and crossed the room to him, and he took her face in both his hands and kissed her, which was the first time, and it was like everything about him, direct and warm and entirely sincere, and she kissed him back with everything she had, which was considerable, and the accounts could wait. They were married in December, in the small white church in Redrock, with Reverend Birch officiating and Clara Delaney in the front pew, radiating the satisfaction of a woman who has seen something coming for a year and is very pleased to be proved right. Caldwell and Reyes stood as witnesses, Caldwell with an expression of dignified emotion, and Reyes with a smile so broad it was practically audible. Ruth came from Missouri with her husband and the 3 children, filling the small church with the warmth of family, and the children behaved reasonably well for approximately the first 15 minutes and reasonably unpredictably after that. Jennie wore a dress she had made herself from blue wool, a clean, simple dress with good lines, and she wore her hair down under a small hat, and she looked, Clara Delaney said afterward to several people, like a woman who had found her proper place in the world. Frank looked like a man who could not quite believe his luck and was extremely grateful for it. They exchanged their vows in the clear winter light of the small church, looking at each other with the seriousness of people who had both been through enough to understand what promises mean and were making them fully aware. When it was done and the Reverend said what Reverends say, Frank reached into his pocket and produced something Jennie had not expected, a small silver chain. He held it up in the winter light coming through the church windows. "For the watch," he said quietly for her ears only, "so you can carry it close and it will not weigh your pocket down." She took the chain from him and looked at it, and then she looked at him, and there were those tears again, the not grief kind, and she said, "Frank Hawkins," and could not immediately find anything else, and he said, "Jennie Hawkins," trying it out, and smiled. She took Daniel's watch from her pocket and threaded the chain through the small ring at the top of the case and clasped the chain around her neck, and the watch rested warm against her heart for the first time in 2 years and 7 months. She carried it differently after that. Still every day, still close, but differently. It was no longer a thing she held against the opening of. It was simply a piece of her history, worn honestly, as a woman wears a piece of her past when she has made her peace with it. The Hawkins Ranch, which was what it was called and continued to be called because that was its proper name, went from strength to strength in the years that followed. Jennie's management of the accounts proved its worth over and over, and Frank's management of the land proved its own, and together they made a whole that was more than the sum of its parts, the way the best partnerships always do. Wade Donovan made one more approach in the spring of 1879, and this time Jennie was present at the gate when he rode up, and it was Jennie who informed him, with the courteous precision of a woman who knows every number in every ledger, that the ranch was in an excellent financial position with no debt outstanding, that they had no interest in selling any portion of it at any price, and that she wished him a pleasant ride back to wherever he had come from. Donovan looked at her with the expression of a man who had not anticipated this and was not pleased about it, and then he looked at Frank, and Frank simply looked back at him with the calm, immovable steadiness that was his natural state when he had nothing to defend against, because nothing was being threatened. Donovan tipped his hat and left, and Jennie and Frank watched him go, and then Frank looked at her with that expression she loved best, the warm, unguarded one. "You are formidable," he said. "I am practical," she said. In the summer of 1879, Jennie realized she was pregnant. She told Frank on a Thursday morning before he went out to the cattle work, sitting across from him at the breakfast table with her hands around her coffee cup. His face went through something remarkable. Surprise, joy, and something that was deeper than joy, something closer to wonder, the expression of a man who has been given more than he expected from the world. He came around the table and knelt beside her chair and took both her hands in his and looked at her with those dark eyes full of that rare, unguarded openness. "Are you well?" he said first, because that was Frank. The practical care came first. "I am well," she said. "Are you happy?" he asked then. She looked at him, this man, this ranch, this life that had assembled itself around her in ways she had not been able to anticipate or plan for, kneeling on the kitchen floor in his work clothes with his hands around hers and his face entirely hers to read. "I am so happy," she said. "I did not think I would ever say that again and mean it this completely. But I am." He pressed her hands to his lips and held them there, and she felt the warmth of it all the way through. Their son was born in March of 1880, in the middle of a night that was cold and clear, delivered by Dr. Mercer with Clara Delaney in attendance because Clara had decided she would be there, and no force of nature was going to prevent it. He was a healthy, substantial baby who announced his arrival with conviction, and then looked at the world with the dark, direct eyes of his father, assessing. Frank, who had been downstairs in a state of concentrated anxiety that he managed by methodically reorganizing the firewood for approximately 2 hours, came upstairs when Mercer called him and stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at Jennie in the bed, holding the baby wrapped in the flannel blanket. And his face was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life, something she could not have described in words with any adequacy. He came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held him with the careful, enormous tenderness of a large man holding something small and precious, looking down at the baby's face with an expression that had no guardedness in it at all, that was entirely open. "He has your eyes," Jennie said. "He has your stubbornness already," Frank said. "Look at that jaw." Clara Delaney, from the chair in the corner, made a sound of deep satisfaction. They named him Daniel James Hawkins. Daniel for the man who had been, and who deserved to be, remembered with love, rather than only grief. James for Frank's father, who had started him on the road to this place. They called him Danny, in the everyday way of it, and he grew into his name and his ranch and his place in the world with the confident directness of a boy who has always known he was wanted. In the spring of 1882, a daughter arrived, who had Jennie's green-gray eyes and Frank's quietness, and an additional quality all her own that was fierce and funny in equal measure. They named her Ruth Clara Hawkins, for the people who had mattered in the making of the life that had made room for her. The garden continued to grow. Jennie expanded it every year, adding beds and varieties, trading seeds with Clara and with other women in Redrock, until it was a proper kitchen garden, and an extravagance of lavender along the south wall that smelled, in July, like something deliberate and blessed. Frank built a second porch on the east side of the house to catch the morning light, because Jennie had mentioned she liked the morning light from her old window in the room at the end of the hall, and Frank was a man who listened, and then did things with what he heard. They hired a second ranch hand in 1881, a young man from the eastern settlements named Cooper, who was 19 and competent and a little lost, and who responded to fair treatment and steady work with the gratitude of someone who had not always found those things, and who became, over the years, a person they trusted and valued, and who became in some ways part of the fabric of the place. Caldwell retired from active ranch work in 1883, his knees finally having their say after decades of horseback work, and settled in Redrock, where he could be found at the barber shop and the general store, offering opinions on cattle and weather and life with the authority of long experience. Rays married a woman from town named Isabel in 1882 and built a small house on the west edge of the Hawkins land, where Frank had given him the right to do so, and their children grew up alongside Danny and Ruth, which made the ranch a noisier and considerably more lively place. Clara Delaney came for Christmas every year, and every year she sat in the same chair she had always sat in and looked at what had been made, and looked at Jennie and Frank, with the expression of a woman who has been right about something important, and does not need to say so because it is entirely evident. On a September evening in 1883, 5 years after Jennie had first driven her listing wagon into Redrock, she was sitting on the east porch with the morning having long since become evening, in the chair Frank had put there for the light she liked. Danny was asleep inside, and Ruth with him, and Frank was on the other chair with a glass of water and his boots off, and the particular looseness of a man at the end of a good, hard day. The watch was at her neck. It was always at her neck now. Frank looked at her in the evening light, the way he had taken to looking at her, with the full attention of a man who has chosen to look and keeps choosing it, every day, with intention. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She put her hand to the watch at her neck out of habit and felt the familiar warmth of the silver case. "I am thinking about the first time I drove into Redrock," she said. "I had everything I owned in a wagon and a watch in my pocket that I could not open, and I was looking for somewhere to be." "Did you find it?" he asked. She looked at him, this man in this light, on this porch of this house on this land that was theirs together, and through the window behind him she could see the lamp on the kitchen table and the shadows of the life they had built moving gently in the evening air. "I found it," she said. He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat together in the September evening on the east porch of the Hawkins ranch, and the watch was warm at her heart, no longer holding grief and no longer kept closed against the truth, simply resting where it belonged, a piece of the past carried with love into the fullness of a present that held more than she had known to ask for. The stars came out above the Texas plains one by one, the enormous, extravagant sky of that country doing what it always did, filling from edge to edge with light, indifferent and magnificent and very beautiful. And Jennie Hawkins, who had been Jennie Townsend, who had driven a listing wagon into a small frontier town with 2 bags and a closed watch and nothing she hoped for, sat in the light of all of it and was entirely, completely, deeply at home. Inside the house, Danny stirred in his sleep and murmured something and fell quiet again. The garden beyond the south wall breathed its lavender smell into the evening air. Somewhere on the range, a cow called and was answered. The rope on the old front porch was finally coiled properly. It had been coiled properly for 4 years now. The accounts were in excellent order. The eastern fence line was sound. Frank's hand was warm in hers, as warm as the watch at her heart, as warm as the light in the window, as warm as everything that had been, against all her reasonable expectation, given back.